Now that we've had an opportunity to, talk about contact centers as a whole and the challenges that are unique to them based upon their environment, their staffing, and the different applications that they're working with, now let's have an opportunity to actually go in and start configuring Unified Service Desk or using Unified Service Desk to help meet these individual requirements and start building the solutions. Now, obviously, before you can build the solution, you have to install the application and you have to make sure that it's set up and configured in an optimal environment based upon what it is that you're trying to do. Are you doing an upgrade of an existing USD implementation? Are you going in and setting up an environment that you're going to use strictly for demo purposes? Or are you building a new solution from scratch and now you have to really start understanding and building those options? And that's really what we want to talk about in this module. So in this module, we want to look first and foremost at, from a deployment perspective, what are the different system requirements that are there from a USD perspective? Because again, it is a desktop application that we will be installing on client machines. We're going to talk a little bit about the different connection options that you have in regards to the environments that you can connect to. So, Dynamics 365 online versus on-premise. We're going to talk about the actual client installation itself. So there's two different kind of tiers to the installation. There's the individual client installation that has to be done on the local machine, and then there is the pushing of the initial configuration data up into your Dynamics 365 implementation. And that can be done with loading sample applications or sample data into your environment. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about what that looks like, because there's different ways you can deploy that data based upon if it's going to be kind of a fresh install and you just want the core functionality there, or if it's going to be something that's going to be used for demo or training or testing purposes versus just kind of an upgrade. So we're going to talk a little bit about what that sample data or those sample connection options look like. And then we're also going to talk just a little bit about the configuration basics. So, what does it look like from inside the application from a configuration standpoint? What are the items that are used to control how things are interacted with inside the application? And so that's really what we want to look at as we start exploring this particular module. So let's first talk just a little bit about the system requirements that you're looking at. So from a deployment perspective, the application itself is pretty straightforward. It runs off of Windows 10, Windows 8, 8.1, Windows 7. It does require Internet Explorer 11, 10, or Internet Explorer 9 if you were using like an older version like CRM 2013. Couple of just little things that you want to keep in mind. From a screen resolution standpoint, it does recommend that you use 1920 by 1080 from a pixel standpoint, and I would highly recommend that as well. You'll sometimes see the application just doesn't necessarily perform as well as it could if you're not using that optimal screen resolution. And the other thing is we recommend that from a zooming perspective, everything uses kind of a 100% zooming scenario. And the reason behind that is that really just ensures optimal execution from a visibility standpoint inside the application, but also makes sure that the application itself is going to perform at kind of an optimal situation. Because the big thing to remember is ultimately what you're doing here is you're opening multiple applications or windows or browser windows inside this shell of this framework. And so the more of those items that you're opening up, the more system resources obviously that you're using, which could then obviously slow things down. So by keeping things optimized within those environments, we just really limit the capabilities for potential issues when you're going through. Now, if you want to connect to a environment or to a Dynamics 365 environment, it does support Dynamics 365 online. You also can connect to older versions like Dynamics CRM 2016, 2015, or 2013 SP1. SP1 for 2013 was when the whole Unified Service Desk solution was actually introduced. And so if you go out, you can download the actual Unified Service Desk installer for the application. There'll be two downloads in the environment that you go through. There'll be the Package Deployer download, which is actually going to be used to push out certain customizations to your Dynamics 365 instance. And then there's the actual client installer. So depending upon the machines that you're working with, there is a 32-bit and a 64-bit client install that you can work with. Now, you can download, you can install that information, connect to your environment, and kind of work from there. Couple of things that I would just recommend when you start talking about the overall application itself. Make sure that you go in and you do your configuration and customization to your environment first. Make sure that all the changes and all the customizations that would need to be used as part of your Dynamics 365 implementation have been done. Set up your security rules, create any custom entities that you might need to have, create any workflows, business process flows, any of those types of situations. The reason why is because after the fact, when you come in and deploy USD, if you make a major change, if it's just a quick little customization, that's not a big deal, but if you make a major change, that can affect USD. And when I say affect USD, it might be from a configurations perspective, it might just be from an application standpoint. So make sure it's very dialed in before you deploy the Unified Service Desk client. It'll just minimize potential for issues moving forward. As far as working and using Unified Service Desk, you do have the capabilities as long as you have kind of your standard professional license that you can work with to be able to access and work with Unified Service Desk. Once you have that kind of professional or enterprise type license, you have access to Unified Service Desk client. You can set up and kind of install it from there. So if you go out to the address that you saw on your slides, or if you just do a search out on your browser for Dynamics 365 Unified Service Desk, it's going to take you to this area where you can go ahead and download the installer. And this is updated, every few months, so you do want to check for kind of new functionality, specifically when you start getting into the updated releases of the information. But if I go out and I click on download, this will give me the information to define. The key thing that you'll see here is there's those two installation clients that we talked about. There's the 64-bit installation client and there's the 32-bit installation client, and then there's the package deployer. So you're going to need at least a combination of both of these individual options. So you can decide based upon what option it is that you're working with, whether you're going to use 32-bit or 64. You're going to then download the information. Once you download the information, then you can go out to your desktop and you can actually start working through that information. So if I go into here, I downloaded the information into a USD stuff. I see a Dynamics 365 USD installation package. I'm going to go ahead and double click on my installation package, and this is just going to walk me through the installation process. Now, if you have an older version of the Unified Service Desk application installed on this computer, it'll recognize that and it'll walk you through an upgrade of the client, which is totally fine. So you can look to see kind of where you're at from that situation, but it'll then upgrade that information as you're moving forward, or it'll just walk through the installation process. One of the other things that it's going to do is it's going to do kind of a prerequisite check. So you do need to have Windows Identity Foundation enabled and set up on the machine, as well as the .NET 4.5.2 framework. So one of the things that it'll do is it'll run out and do a check and see if you have those core prerequisite components. If you don't, it'll then install that information as part of the setup and installation procedure for the application itself. So I'm going to go ahead and I will just install the application. It'll run through the installation process. The actual upgrade or installation of the Unified Service Desk client doesn't take very long. It just takes a couple of minutes. It'll go through. The thing that takes kind of a while is that first initial setup onto your organizational environment, and we'll show you that as well. But we'll let this walk through the installation. Once it's done, then we can go ahead and hit finish. That'll allow us to move on, and then we can go on from there. So it's just finishing up the installation. We'll give it one final second to finish it up. Then we'll go ahead and finish and then move on from there. So you'll see that it's creating my desktop shortcut. I also chose to have it create the shortcut on the taskbar as well, which it's done that as well. Now it's ready to go. Now at this point, I can launch this if I want to, or I can go on from there. I haven't configured it inside my Dynamics 365 organization yet, so launching it is really just going to open up a blank shell. There isn't really an environment to connect to. So for this purpose at this point, I would recommend just kind of closing it down and then moving on and doing your initial organization configuration, which we'll do next. The next piece to this, after you have the client installed, or even before you have the client installed, you could lead off with this if you wanted to, is to set up the Unified Service Desk configuration components inside your Dynamics 365 organization. And so because, as we mentioned, most of the configuration that you're actually going to do is going to take place inside your Dynamics 365 implementation. So what they've done is they've created a package deployer that allows you to go out and install the necessary managed solutions as well as some sample data inside your organization to use for baseline configuration. And so that's the next procedure. Now this one takes a little bit more time, whereas you saw with the client installation, that takes just a few minutes or a minute or so to do. This particular one, depending upon what options you choose, could take anywhere between 30 to 45 minutes depending upon the situation. So what you're going to do is, and we'll show you this in the demo, is you're going to run your package deployer. You're then going to connect to your environment, and then you're going to walk through. Before we do that, there's just a couple of things that I want to draw your attention to. So inside that package, you're going to really see 4 different options that you can choose from a deployment standpoint. There's kind of a new environment, there's a Dynamics 365 web client, there's an interactive service hub, and then there's an update package. Depending upon what it is that you are trying to do, you're going to choose any one of these individual options. New environment, this is the one that you're going to use for most of your situations when you start talking about core USD deployments. This is going to have just your core UII information and USD solutions. It might have a few pieces of sample data, but this is going to have just the baseline information that you can use to build kind of a clean USD deployment from the ground up. If you're doing any implementations of USD from kind of a customer standpoint or an organizational standpoint, this would be the one that you would use most often from within that situation. It'll give you a starting point. You also could build it from the ground up, but in this situation, you're typically going to do kind of the new environment. That's more clean type situation. If you're looking to demo the application for customers or build some little functionality based upon those demo environments, then you can use the Dynamics 365 web client. That's going to have all of your UII information as well as kind of the baseline USD controls as well as sample data, but that's also going to have some kind of custom KPI information. It'll have a sample line of business application. It's really meant for demo environments. If you're going to be building this for yourself or for a customer, don't choose this particular option. This is really for demos. Same thing with Interactive Service Hub. It's very similar to what you would see with the second option, except for from an Interactive Service Hub perspective, it's going to have all of the Interactive Service Hub pages. So it's going to have a much more Interactive Service Hub feel to it from a look and feel. So it really depends upon who the customer is that you want to target that information in. In a new environment, you still have the Interactive Service Hub information, so if you want to build the solution for Interactive Service Hub, you could. And then the final one that you would have is your upgrade package or your update package. If you've already installed USD in this environment, you can do an update package and that'll upgrade your existing solution and then install kind of the core information without any sample or configuration data. So it'll understand that you already have the environment, it's just going to upgrade it or install the key components, but the key thing here is there won't be any sample data that'll be pushed off as part of it. So let's show you what that sample or that installation process looks like using Package Deployer. So after I've downloaded the information, I'll see that I have a Package Deployer option. I can go ahead and I can double click on this, and this application is just going to go ahead and kind of run. It might ask me to extract the information, and that's fine. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to accept my license agreement and then continue on. Then it's going to ask me where I want to extract this information to. So out on the desktop, I'm just going to make a new folder. I'm going to call this USD install. Let it extract my information. It'll take just a couple of seconds to kind of build that environment. And then once it's done, then it'll actually start walking me through the installation procedure, and we'll show you exactly what that looks like here in just a second. So we'll give it just one more sec to finish extracting the information. Now, the key thing to remember as this is going through, and I'm going to mention it several times even before we get to that point, is if you use the sample option, so if you use the web client or the interactive service hub, those are not designed for production environments. Those were really designed to give you kind of a sample USD implementation that you can use from a demoing perspective. And that's what we'll use for the purposes of this course. But in a normal environment, you would typically go through and install the new environment. So in this situation, we'll go ahead and we'll say continue. It's then going to walk through and ask me to connect. So you can see that I can connect this to an on-prem environment, or I can connect this to an online environment. So it basically wants to know what is the Office 365 environment that I want to connect to. So in this case, I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to click on Office 365. Then I'm going to click on Show Advanced, and this is going to give me my authentication options that I can use to authenticate to the environment. So based upon the region that you're in, you can specify what specific environment you want to work with. You can supply your connection credentials. So in this case, I'll go ahead and do mine. Now, the other option here that you have is to display a list of available organizations. If you have a testing environment, if you have a demo environment, if you have multiple environments that you want to work with, I would highly suggest clicking the display list of available organizations, because this will show you each organization that you can connect to. So in this case, I'll go ahead and I'll log in. It's going to connect to my organization. It's going to determine what specific organization I want to use. So then it'll display back my available organizations. I'll pick the one that I want to work with. I'll go ahead and log into that organization. It'll connect to that environment, and then it will proceed to ask me what particular environment I want to work with. So again, this is those options that we've talked about from the import packages. What specific import packages do you want it to bring in? Is this a new environment, demo environment? What option do you want to use? For our purposes today, we're going to go ahead and do kind of a demo environment. So I'm going to go ahead and pick the Microsoft Dynamics 365 web client option. But again, if this was a production environment, I would do the new environment, so I just get kind of the core competencies. I'm going to go ahead and hit next. Then it's going to go through and just, tell me kind of what's happening within this situation. That's fine. We'll go ahead and click on next again. Then we'll go ahead and one more time. So then it's going to go through kind of an initial import option. So it's going to look at, kind of find your solutions that are involved in this environment, initiate the connections for the data that's actually going to be imported, because in addition to managed solutions that will be brought into this environment, it'll also have some sample data that it will install into your environment as well. Once this particular procedure is done, then you can go ahead and hit next. And this is where the actual install takes place. And now I actually have already installed this just from a time perspective. Normally what it's going to do here is it's going to go through and look at all of your baseline information. And this is where it can take a fair amount of time. Prepare for between, like I said, 30 to 45 minutes for an install to take place. But it'll look at your environment, it'll determine if there's any information in there that need to be imported in, and then it'll import that information into your environment and kind of work with it from there. We'll let this process just kind of continue, and then when it's done, we'll go ahead and kind of pick it up from there. Now that everything has been done and it's installed and it's kind of executed everything, now I can go ahead and I can hit next and finish. And now all of that information is done and I'm ready to utilize the application. So now let's go ahead and open up Unified Service Desk. So I'm going to go ahead and double click on the Unified Service Desk icon, and it's going to open it up. Now the first time you connect to an organization or to an environment, it's going to give you that same connection-based information that we were using earlier. So this is where you have to determine Office 365, just like we did before. You have to go into your Show Advanced. You have to associate it with your region, specify your username and password that you want to use to connect with. Now again, I would also choose the display list of available organizations. You're going to go ahead and you're going to hit log in. Pick the organization you want to connect to and then log in. And then it's going to go out and it's going to log into that particular environment. Now again, every time that you make a configuration change or do something, we'll have to reload some of that information. So particularly the first time that it loads up and connects to an environment, you might see that it takes a fair amount of time to connect to it. That is totally fine. Don't worry about that. We'll just give it a few seconds here to kind of go ahead and connect. Once it's loaded in, then it'll go ahead and initiate the user interface. It'll load up the information based upon that user interface, and then based upon the solution and the configuration elements that you've actually brought in, it'll bring that information in. So now I can see I've got my toolbars that I can work with, and I can start going through items from there. Now, I want to show you just one other kind of key piece to this real quick. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to close out of here. It remembers the organization that you connected to. So obviously I connected to this particular item when I set it up. The next time that I go into Unified Service Desk and I open this up, it's going to assume that I want to connect to the same environment. There is a change credentials option. When I click on that, and I'll show you that one more time here just because it goes quick. When I double click on this and I click on change credentials, this gives me the opportunity to reconnect or maybe connect to a different environment. So if I have the Unified Service Desk solution installed in another environment, I can do that. Otherwise, if you don't hit change credentials, it'll just connect to the environment that you were just most recently in, load it up into that environment, and then off you go. But if you ever do need to change your credentials, so if you have the USD client installed, but you want to connect to different environments, you do have the capabilities to do that just by simply clicking on the change credentials option. Once that is set up and ready to go, now you're ready to go into Dynamics 365 and start configuring the different elements. And that's the next thing that we'll talk about, is the configuration aspect of the application. So before we go in and talk about kind of the configuration aspects of the application, let's talk about the architecture around how USD was built, so you understand exactly what kind of takes place within there. So it uses much of a what's called kind of an event-driven architecture, where some type of event is going to take place. The application is going to respond to that event, and then based upon what happens within that response, do something. So think about it from a standpoint where we've got different line of business applications that we want to integrate with. Maybe we have phone applications that we want to integrate with. Maybe we just have Dynamics 365 as a whole that we want to integrate with. And all of those items basically take place through what are called hosted controls. So if I want to interact with a phone system, I am going to use a hosted control to interact with that phone system. If I want to integrate with a line of business application or a third-party application, I'm going to use a hosted control to interact with that application. If I want to interact with Dynamics 365 or a web page, I'm going to use a hosted control, which is basically going to interact with that particular application. Now, each one of those hosted controls are going to have events that take place. So for example, when I say I want to open up a Dynamics 365 record inside the application, that's going to raise an event, and that event is that it's opening the application or opening the record. When that record is opened and it's finally been completed with that open, that event or that item is going to register that it's been completed. When I launch Unified Service Desk, I'm launching the application. Once the application is ready, there's an event called Desktop Ready that lets us know that the application has been loaded 100% and it's ready to move. And so what happens is these events register within the application, and we use what are called action calls to actually process the item that we want to go through. So for example, once the application is loaded, maybe I want to go ahead and I want to open up a specific dashboard inside the application. I will use an action call to initiate what's called an action to open up an action, or to open up a specific dashboard inside Dynamics 365, and I use what are called replacement parameters to define what specific dashboard I want to open up. So if I want to open up an account record, I'm going to have a hosted control where I'm going to store the account or the item that I want to open up. I'm going to have an action call which will basically specify where I want to load that information inside the application, and I'm going to use replacement parameters to be able to define what specific account inside Dynamics 365 I want to open up. And what that action call does is it initiates what's called a UII action, or an action inside the application that'll actually fire that. And you saw that when we did the demo a little bit. When we clicked on a specific account based based upon that search situation, it launched a UII action that opened up that particular hosted control inside the application. That action was initiated through an action call, and that action call had replacement parameters in it that defined this is the specific account that we want to open up inside the application. And so that's how, from a USD perspective, the architecture kind of meets that individual situation. So let's talk a little bit about the configuration components, or the elements that you're going to see inside that unified service desk implementation. Some of the core functionality that you're going to see and that we'll talk about over the context of this course are the things that you see under the fundamentals. Those are things like hosted controls, events, UII actions, action calls, replacement parameters. These are kind of key fundamental elements that make up and build most of the USD implementations that you'll be doing. Then you get more into kind of your UII and navigation elements. Those are going to be things like navigation rules, which are going to control how these individual windows open up inside the application. Your toolbars, which are going to show up on the different elements of the application that allow you to click or select something and have it constitute that within the application itself. Your agent scripts, where you can provide people with kind of guided processes as people are moving forward. Your session lines, which control what sessions or where things are displayed in the application. And then you can get into some of your initial kind of forms and configurations, and we'll talk a little bit more about each one of those as we go through. But the fundamental components that you're going to see inside your Unified Service Desk implementation are really your hosted controls, your events, your action calls, your parameters, your navigation rules, toolbars. Those are really going to be the items that we're going to focus on for the remainder of this course. Now, before we get into each one of those in kind of their own specific detail, let's just talk a little bit about what a hosted control, or what some of these kind of key components are. So from a hosted control standpoint, these are the individual components that you are going to piece together to make your desired functionality. Think of your hosted controls almost like Legos. These are the items that you're going to piece together, and depending upon how you piece them together, you're going to build different functionality inside the application. These are the things that are going to allow you to open up Dynamics 365 records in the application. This is the items that are going to allow you to open up a third-party custom hosted application, open up a web page, open up the debugger. These are the things that are going to store the individual items that are going to be displayed inside the application. So they're really kind of just a holding tank for all the different information that you're going through. And as you build these individual pieces together, now you will build the overall functionality that you're going to use inside the application itself. Another item that you're going to see is what are called action calls. And so the action call is what is actually going to be doing stuff inside the application itself. The action call is going to take data from the session itself, as well as parameters that have been passed across to that item, and they're going to do something with it. So for example, an action call is going to load something into a hosted control. So for example, I might have a hosted control that I'm going to use to open up an account inside the application itself. So I have a hosted control called account. An action call is going to initiate the process of loading information into that hosted control. So what it's going to do is it's going to take specific parameters as well as information about the record that I clicked on, and it's going to pass that, it's going to perform that action, and it's going to pass that information into the hosted control, and that's what's ultimately going to display that account record inside the application. The nice thing about action calls is they can really be accessed through a variety of different areas with the application. You can create toolbar buttons that have action calls associated with them, so when somebody clicks on that toolbar button, it does something. You can have them run in response to events. So again, once the application loads, or once one of these specific action or hosted controls load inside the application, an action call can respond to that event and now do something. Routing rules, there's a lot of different options when you're going with it, but these are the things that actually make stuff happen inside the application itself. And we'll talk quite a bit about action calls in another module when we start moving forward. Events are your notifications inside Unified Service Desk that tell us that something important happened. This hosted control, the item in this record was saved. This item was opened. This particular thing, the desktop is ready to go. Somebody clicked on this button. It's an event that gets passed through the system. Now, what happens with that is as these events take place, the action calls that you build inside the application can run in response to those events. So now you can start driving specific behavior throughout the context of the application. And so an event is really a cornerstone building what's happening inside there and then moving forward from there as you're going through. Agent scripts, those are obviously the scripting tool that prompts agents on what they should say. So this would give you kind of that guidance. So if I'm going to answer a phone call on a specific case type situation, I can have a script that pops up. I can ask that user, or I can ask the person that's calling into that situation a specific question. Based upon how they answer that question, I can select specific items inside the agent script, and that's going to move me forward from there. What's nice about the agent scripting is I can use action calls inside the application to do other stuff inside the application based upon what people click on. And it's 100% interactive and in the context of what they're currently doing. So it looks at who the customer is that they're currently serving, what specific items that they're clicking on, and then it drives them in those specific directions. And so the agent scripts are really kind of a critical piece that gets built into what people would do. And then you also have your navigation rules, and your navigation rules define kind of the behavior that happens in the system. So if you think about like a normal CRM or Dynamics 365 record, when somebody clicks on something, when somebody clicks on a link inside the application, it opens that up inline. What a navigation rule says is when I open up this window, so if somebody clicks on a contact inside an account, do I want that contact to open up right in line in that specific window, or do I want that to open up in a whole other aspect of the application? That's what window navigation rules look at, is they determine what should load into the item and where it should be loaded into the application. Should it load on top of what you have, or should it load into another area? And again, we're going to get into each one of these individual items in much, much more detail as we move forward. Session lines will control where things, how things are displayed. Session lines give you the capabilities to see kind of the 360-degree view of what's happening. So in the context of the record that you're working with, session lines display information kind of over on the left-hand side that give you information that's really of high importance based upon what it is that you're trying to do. And we'll show you a little bit more of all of that information as we move forward. And then the final one that we have is toolbars. And toolbars really are the items that you're going to interact with when you start clicking on them. The toolbars can be associated with different hosted controls. They can be associated with the actual main application itself. And when somebody clicks on a specific toolbar, it'll initiate some type of action call within the application that'll then incorporate some other type of element inside the application as well. So we're going to get into each one of these in a little bit more detail, but let's talk a little bit about that. So when you install the Unified Service Desk solution, if you go into settings, you will see underneath settings, you will see a Unified Service Desk option. And when you open up that Unified Service Desk option, this will give you all the different configurable elements that you can build in. So we can see things like those hosted controls that we talked about, or the action calls and the toolbars and the events. This is where you will actually start building and configuring the application itself. And so when I click on, for example, hosted controls, this is going to show me all the different hosted controls that are brought into this application. Now, each one of these hosted controls will vary a little bit based upon the solution. Remember, we installed the sample solution into the environment, so that's why I'm seeing all of these different hosted controls in there. But these are the different areas that you can see. So you can see we have a hosted control that we're using for accounts. We have a hosted control that we're using for contacts. We also have a hosted control that opens up Bing and uses the Bing map functionality. We have one that connects to Facebook. These are any number of different types of situations. And in the next module, we'll talk quite a bit about hosted controls in general. But the key thing to remember about the configuration elements when you start talking about Unified Service Desk is these are really just records that you are creating that correspond with the individual items that you want to go through. Same thing like, for example, with toolbars. If I click on toolbars, these are the different toolbars that we have in the application. So remember, we went into that main toolbar earlier and we clicked on that main toolbar. This is what is making up the individual buttons and items that represent the main toolbar inside the application. So here I can see there's that dashboard button, there's that My Work button, there's the applications and the reminders. These are the items that constituted those individual things that we clicked at inside the application. So now you can start to see from a configuration perspective how that information translates back into what we saw inside the actual application itself. And so as we configure and build these specific key components, now we start to see exactly how that's going to be inside the application as well. So now that we've seen how that configuration looks like inside the application, let's tie it back to what you see inside Unified Service Desk now so you can start to make a little bit more sense of those items. So we talked about the toolbars. So obviously when I click on the toolbar option, I can now go ahead and I can click on a specific option. And what it's doing inside here now is it is opening up another hosted control. So we have a hosted control inside our configuration element called search. And this search hosted control allows us to use an action call to basically say, this is what I want to open up inside the application. So this is kind of my entity-based search. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to search for an item. It's going to show me AdventureWorks. I'm going to go ahead and click on AdventureWorks. And so now it's opening up a new session. So we're using kind of a navigation rule that says when we click on this option, it's going to open up a new session. It's opening up a new session. Let me allow pop-ups. It's opening up a new session inside the application. Inside that session, it is opening up multiple hosted controls. So there's that account hosted control that we talked about, which is going to open up that account record inside the application. So it looked at the context of the record that we wanted to go through, and then it opened that up inside. So you can see it created a new session that has that account information associated with it. Inside that account hosted control, here's another one of those toolbars. So I have a toolbar that allows me to work with associated cases. I have a toolbar that allows me to work with associated contacts. As I click on these individual elements, it'll then start to display that item inside those individual hosted controls. I also have over here on the side, I have my call script. So this is the item that allows me to see from a scripting perspective what I want to do. I can see if I'm working with kind of a new service request, I can click on that. This is all mapped back to that agent scenario. But these are all different hosted control elements that I'm interacting with as part of the application. And so this is where you can now start to really see the individualized aspect of how those items work through. When it first loaded into the application, there was an event that was triggered based upon that loading functionality that loaded in this particular dashboard. So it realized that the functionality was in there. It figured and triggered off an event that loaded that information in. So these are how those different configuration elements start to correspond with what's taking place. Each one of these items has a corresponding action call that defines what specific functionality I want to load based upon what it is that I'm clicking on. And so this, when I click on My Work, this has an action call that is loading up the My Work dashboard, and it's pulling that information in and it's working within the context. And so this is how those different configuration pieces fit. So what we're going to show you now for kind of the remainder of this is we're going to build some of these different functionalities and show you how they start to get consumed inside the application. So initially, as you can see, the concept of setting up and getting it installed isn't overly difficult. It's a matter of understanding what your specific use case is in this particular environment. Are you doing a new option? Are you doing an existing option? Are you going to be doing kind of a demo functionality? What do you want to look at? So in this module, we really wanted to understand how the application, is set up and restored, what are the system requirements, and kind of moved on from there. So big things to remember about this module is from an event standpoint, Unified Service Desk uses a event-driven architecture. So events drive what's happening in the application. Somebody clicks on a toolbar button, that's going to initiate an action call, which is going to load a hosted control, which is going to perform some type of functionality within the application. An event is going to be raised that is going to initiate a navigation rule that's going to control how somebody navigates to a specific page when they're working through it. When you are installing the Unified Service Desk package, you have 4 options that you can choose from an installation standpoint. You can do a new installation, which installs really just the 4 base the critical components that you would need for that implementation. You can do a web client installation, which is really more used for demonstration type purposes or demo environment purposes. You can do a interactive service hub implementation, which focuses the implementation more on the interactive service hub baseline scenarios, or you could do kind of an upgrade. Either one of those situations is fine. Just remember that if you do choose any of the sample data, so the web client, the interactive service hub, those really should only be done for kind of proof of concept and demoing purposes. If you do want to build a successful USD deployment, we do recommend that you build it from the ground up. And really the easiest way to do that is to do kind of a new environment and then start building your hosted controls and configuring your information from there. And then once it's installed, all of the configurations, so all of the declarations for your hosted controls, your toolbars, your events, and the items that you're going to be used are all done from within the Unified Service Desk interface. And so you go inside to Dynamics 365, navigate to your Unified Service Desk, and then do your configuration elements